Rich in history and culture, Albuquerque, New Mexico is a scenic southwestern urban oasis.
Albuquerque, it's a high desert climate. We have over 320 days of sunshine a year. And the mountains and the city views and the scenic views, and hiking and things like that. It's a great destination and it's a great place to live.
And for 27-year-old native Peggy Klinke, Albuquerque is the perfect place to parlay her passion for health and wellness into a new career.
Peggy was a health freak. She would work out every day. Health was really important to her. She decided she wanted to be a doctor, and so she started taking the pre-med classes she needed to get into medical school.
And at school, Peggy catches the eye of another fellow student, 34-year-old Patrick Kennedy.
Don't worry about it.
Hi. Peggy, right? I'm Patrick.
Yeah, Patrick, I know. We're in the same study group.
Oh, right. Of course, that's dumb. I'm not good at this. Just a engineering geek trying to keep up with these kids.
It makes two of us. Well, at least the keeping up part.
She was an older student, and Patrick was older too. They were taking a lot of the same science and math classes that she needed for her pre-med major, and then he was taking the same courses for engineering.
You know, I'm gonna grab a bite to eat if you want to join me.
Yeah,
Good.
I'd like that.
Good. Because I think they're about to kick us out of here.
Peggy and Patrick begin to get to know each other outside of class.
The ice cream shows here are great.
I'm an Ohio girl. We're pretty simple.
I've never been to Ohio, but I don't think you're simple. I think you're fantastic.
People had always told her she was beautiful, and I think for the longest time she thought that's all she was. That was her insecurity, is that people only valued her for her looks and they never thought she was smart enough or good enough.
I will have the tostada with the corn shell, cheese and dressing on the side, and no meat, please.
And I'll have the hash green chili and 2 glasses of white wine, please. Okay. There you go. Vegetarian.
I promise I'm still fun.
Well, you're just full of surprises, aren't you, Miss Klinke? I like that. 2 new friendships.
New friendships. So, what made you go back to school?
New start. Figured I could make more of myself as an electrical engineer than a landscaper. And once the divorce went through, I figured what better time for a fresh start.
I didn't mean to pry.
You're not prying. I don't mind. My ex-wife is a little crazy, but I still got to see my daughter out of the deal, so it's worth it.
Your daughter?
Yeah. She's 7, going on 30. She's the only woman in my life who I know can't leave me.
I have 3 nieces. I adore them.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, though, I can imagine divorce must be hard on everyone.
It's for the best. Yeah, I'm just glad that it didn't scare you off.
And why would it?
Oh, it was baggage. Tell you the truth, I've always imagined myself growing old, surrounded by tons of kids and grandkids.
That makes 2 of us.
Patrick was a very bright man. And so I think the attraction for her was that here was, this really intelligent guy who was attracted to her.
When she isn't studying, Peggy supports herself by teaching yoga classes at a local studio. But as she arrives before sunrise to prepare for class, it appears Peggy's not alone.
She taught yoga classes at 6 in the morning. She was like, well, do you want to go to a yoga class with me? But I'm like, yeah, I don't see myself ever getting up at 5 in the morning to go to a yoga class.
Hello? James, you scared me.
Oh, the door was open, so I let myself in.
You didn't want the light?
I like to meditate in the dark before class. It clears my mind.
Is that your car out front?
Yeah.
Over the next several weeks, as Peggy and Patrick spend more and more time together, a full-blown romance blossoms.
It's me.
Come on in. Sorry, I'm running a little behind on dinner.
Need help with anything?
Could you grab the wine in the fridge?
What's in Ohio?
Oh, my mom's place for Christmas.
Oh, I was hoping we'd do something, just the two of us.
It's just for 5 days. You could do something special when I get back, just the two of us. I would love that.
Peggy loved her family and loved being with her family. I think it was difficult for her being so far away from her family. So for Christmas, she came back to Ohio to my mom's house.
But Peggy and her family have no idea a surprise is headed their way.
Honey, could you run into the kitchen and grab the big red bowl for me, please? Thank you.
Hey, I got the napkins. Here you go. Hey, Debbie, your beans are way too long. You should be getting 3 pieces per bean at least. See? Perfect. Oh, you got it. Look at that.
A few days before New Year's Eve, the doorbell rings at my mom's house,
It's Patrick.
and Patrick Kennedy's standing on my mother's front porch.
Did you invite him?
I didn't even tell her where Mom lives.
Who just shows up like that?
The only thing that I knew about this guy was that Peggy had gone on a few dates with him.
Oh my God, Patrick, what are you doing here?
I just couldn't bear the thought of us being apart. Even if it is for only 5 days.
You shouldn't have, really.
Hey, anything for my girl. Besides, I wouldn't want to miss a chance to meet your family. You're always talking about everyone and...
Of course, come in. Patrick, this is my sister, Deb. Patrick.
Hello, Debbie.
Hi. It's nice to meet you.
I am so sorry. Can I use the restroom?
Sure. Right down the hall. What? How does he know where we live?
I was shocked that he was here to spend the holidays with us. And I looked at Peggy, and she did not look happy about the situation. I think she was just as shocked as the rest of the family was that he was present.
I'm so sorry to spring myself on you guys. I know it seems a little crazy, but I also know how important family is to Peggy, and I figured a little holiday surprise would be nice, right?
Come on in. We're just making dinner, so.
Prepared. Unfortunately, yes.
We had no plans that this person was going to be spending the New Year's with us. My mom's a very welcoming, the more the merrier type person. I don't think she was prepared for this. None of us were prepared, so it was a very uneasy feeling.
Despite his sudden guest appearance, Peggy and her family do their best to make Patrick feel at home.
Patrick? Patrick? Where are you? Scared me.
I'm sorry. You're so cute when you're mad. Stay here with me.
My family's super old-fashioned.
You're almost 30.
Yeah, well, house rules. That'll never change.
Nobody has to know. Come on, what are they going to think when we tell them we're moving in together?
You You want to move in with me?
Isn't it obvious? I can't live without you. The sooner we just get on with it, the better, right?
Yes. Well, sleep well.
Okay. I love you, Becky.
He was there about 4 or 5 days. It was awkward the whole time he was there. And I felt like he was trying so hard to get us to like him, and it wasn't happening.
After they return to Albuquerque, Peggy and Patrick move in together. And that's when Peggy discovers Patrick is hiding something from her. When 28-year-old Peggy Klinke moves in with her boyfriend Patrick Kennedy, she uncovers a dark new detail about his life.
Patrick had guns. I know she didn't like it.
Cold feet?
I didn't know you had a gun.
Oh, that. Yeah. Yes. My grandfather's. I keep it around mostly for sentimental reasons. Don't worry. It's not loaded.
Just having it around makes me uncomfortable. I don't like guns, Patrick.
I'll keep it safe.
But for Peggy and Patrick, there's even more conflict ahead.
Namaste. Thank you, everyone. See you on Thursday. It is so good to see you. I missed you. You're feeling better? Good. Okay. Take care of yourself.
Hey, so I was wondering if maybe you could help me with a few poses. I work in construction, my back's always like really tight, and this class is the only thing that helps.
Well, I am supposed to grab breakfast with my boyfriend in a little bit, but I can show you some pointers.
Boyfriend, right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know why I thought you were single. Of course.
We were talking about some poses, James.
Right, yeah.
I don't think she recognized, how attractive she was. Guys would hit on her all the time. So I think she was really uncomfortable with that.
Well, let's start with an easy twist.
Okay.
Great.
So,
Great, yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Okay.
I'm sorry.
And this is an isometric exercise that will help with your core.
Okay.
And we are working on your core, James, not your eyes.
I can't help it.
Hey, Peggy.
Patrick, you're early.
I didn't know you had office hours.
This is one of my students, James. He's in construction. James, Patrick James.
Her boyfriend.
That's a firm grip you got there.
A man should have a firm handshake, don't you think?
Okay, that's enough for today. We'll pick it up on Thursday. Hi.
Sure thing, Peggy.
Bye, James. Is this what you're doing when I'm not here?
What's wrong, Patrick?
I want you to stop teaching yoga.
What? What are you talking about?
That guy, your students, I see how they look at you. And now they are hitting on you right in front of me.
Hey, I love you, and nobody can change that. Let's go, Patrick.
You sure I'm invited? I'm not one of your students.
I think when she moved in with Patrick, I think he started to isolate her, so she didn't really spend any time with any other students. His behavior towards her was becoming more and more controlling. It was clearly behavior to show that she belonged to him.
And with Patrick, it seems no matter what Peggy does, she can't win.
Hey, you're up early.
Are you seriously going out like that?
I always dress like this when I teach.
You look like a slut.
You're unbelievable, you know that?
Me? I thought we decided no more yoga, and here you are dressed and ready for one more round with James and construction.
Are you listening to yourself right now? Teaching yoga has nothing to do with James. You know how important it is to me.
Could have fooled me.
Stop it, Patrick.
Patrick showed frequent signs of jealousy, and it wasn't even with Peggy looking at another man or talking about another man. It was everything. Anytime attention was not given to him, he was jealous. He didn't like it. It didn't take much to push Patrick over the edge.
As Patrick's verbal abuse intensifies, Peggy starts to reevaluate their relationship.
I remember she came over for dinner once, and she was asking my husband and me, how do you know if your relationship is good? How do you know you're with the right person? And I remember telling her, if being with this person makes you stronger or better, or you feel like you are a much better person with this person than you are by yourself, then it's a good relationship. If you are with someone who makes you feel less than you are, then it's the wrong relationship. It's the wrong person. And I think after that, she was like, yeah, I'm in the wrong relationship then. I think she started to realize that this relationship isn't healthy.
Hey. Oh, thank God you're okay.
I'm in the library. Why wouldn't I be okay?
Patrick called me. Apparently he's been calling around and asking about where you are.
You've got to be kidding me. We got in a fight. He called me a slut and I stormed out.
Peggy, that is not okay.
Peggy and I had frequent conversations about her relationship with Patrick. He would call her a slut, put her down, no one's going to hire someone as stupid as you. There was tons of verbal abuse. If you imagine a bright flame slowly burning out and being snuffed away, that's sort of what I saw happening to Peggy during this relationship.
Has he ever been violent with you?
Not once, Deb, I promise. He's just jealous. He walked in on me teaching a student some poses and he's blowing it out of proportion.
Okay, but listen, this level of jealousy, it's not going to lead to anything healthy in my opinion.
I should just leave and not say anything.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what it takes, Peggy.
I just want you to be happy and safe.
There was a wedding in Ohio that Peggy was coming home from. Her best friend was getting married. Patrick was not invited, but he found out that Peggy was going to go back home, so he canceled her flight, and he made flight arrangements for himself and for her. Everywhere that Peggy went, he had to be with her. So that to me was really, really concerning. But I think the deeper Peggy got into the relationship, the harder it was for her to get out.
After years of enduring Patrick's controlling and cruel behavior, Peggy decides it's time to make a big move.
This was 3-4 years in the making. Peggy decided, I don't care what the punishment is, I don't care what the repercussions are, I'm done, I've had it.
I remember she called me and she was crying. And we had a spare bedroom and I said, just come stay with us. She's like, I think I'm just gonna take like whatever clothes I can throw in my car right now. I'm not even gonna worry about anything else. Right now, I just need to get out.
Thank you so much.
Peggy called me and told me I finally moved out, which was great for about 4 seconds. Patrick was severely angry, and we had no idea what we were dealing with.
After Peggy Klinke leaves her domineering ex-boyfriend Patrick Kennedy, she's ready to move on with her life.
Sorry, I'm late. You just keep warming up. We'll get started shortly.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, fine.
Let me guess, you and your boyfriend broke up. And you're wondering if you're ever gonna find anyone.
Been spying on me?
It's all over your face, but I can help you take your mind off that.
I'm flattered, James, but it's a bad idea to mix students in my personal life.
I mean, I could always quit yoga, and then, I'm not technically a student anymore.
We're gonna get started. Namaste. Thank you, everyone. See you on Thursday.
Hey, sorry I was late.
I was too, don't worry.
It was a great class.
Great.
I'd never done yoga before, but I can't believe I waited this long. I'm Mark.
Peggy.
Nice to meet you, Peggy.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, I was wondering if maybe you could help me with some of those poses we talked about earlier?
I can't today, James. I'm in a hurry. Gotta go.
Hey, I'll see you next week.
But as Peggy tries to move forward, Patrick's behavior turns ugly.
So when Peggy left, Patrick didn't know where she was living, but he did have contact with her via cell phone. That's what he started with. Calling her, texting her 50 times a day, 150 times a day, sometimes from his cell phone, sometimes from payphones.
You need to stop calling me.
I'm sorry, Peggy, I was wrong. I just want to talk.
There's nothing to talk about, Patrick.
What do you want me to do? I am calling you to fix this.
It's too late. 17 times today.
Hey, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you sitting here and I just wanted to make sure everything was okay.
Yes, I'm fine. Sorry.
No apology needed. It's okay. I wanted to, just in case you ever wanted to hang out or something.
Your number?
Yeah. Hey, I had a great class today.
Good.
I'll see you around.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
Eager to distance herself from Patrick, Peggy decides to meet with Mark outside of class.
So, how was it you're not married already?
I'm lucky.
I'm serious.
She was excited about meeting Mark. Peggy talked about him way more than she ever talked about Patrick.
I mean, I've dated. I just haven't met the one yet.
I'm surprised I didn't have to wait in line. Wayne, you're smart, you're sexy, you're funny, and you're gonna be a doctor.
I mean, at this point, I'll be 45 by the time I actually start practicing medicine.
You know, you can do a lot in the medical field without actually going to medical school. I work in pharmaceutical sales. I make a pretty good living. The hours are flexible, and Still get to help people. If you like, I can make some calls. Maybe at least get you an interview.
You hardly know me.
I know enough.
Mark was so good to Peggy. I just loved seeing her with someone who actually treated her really well, like somebody who clearly cared about her. You could just see the back and forth with the two of them. This is who she should have been with all along, somebody who recognized how wonderful and how great she is.
But as Peggy's relationship with Mark takes off, she can't seem to shake her old unwanted baggage.
Patrick began stalking Peggy. He started following her because he knew where her gym was, the yoga studio, her hair salon, nail salon.
Hi, Peggy.
What are you doing here? We're done, Patrick. I want you to leave me alone.
Don't say that, okay? We're meant to be together.
And he wasn't going to back off. He had a mission. And I think she truly was in fear of her life at that moment.
Whatever you're thinking about doing right now, you don't have to.
What would I do?
He jumped out to surprise her and opened up a box with a engagement ring.
Marry me, Peggy.
Leave me alone, Patrick. It's over.
If you are giving somebody no indication whatsoever that you intend to carry on a relationship with them, let alone a marriage proposal and a marriage, and in their mind, they believe strongly enough and convincingly enough that that's their next step, you have to realize I might be in some trouble here.
After Peggy rejects his marriage proposal, Patrick seeks revenge.
Hi. How is everyone?
When Peggy wasn't engaging in anything, including the marriage proposal, Patrick took a picture of Peggy and he made a flyer out of it. He put, "I'm a slut, I'm a whore, I sleep with several men, call me," and he put her cell phone number on it. To make matters worse, he made about 300 copies of that flyer and he put them everywhere throughout the city of Albuquerque, including her nail salon and her yoga studio.
She brought me the flyer. She was just like, oh my God. Now it was escalating to the point of he was terrorizing her.
In an effort to stop Patrick's increasingly menacing behavior, Peggy appeals to the police for help.
She took the flyer in, had a conversation with an officer about stalking, and he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's just a piece of paper. Come back to us when something happens."
After the flyer incident, Peggy changes her phone number. Once again, Patrick retaliates.
Mark and Peggy were in Florida for my brother's wedding. The evening after my brother's wedding, Mark got that call from his neighbor.
Here, I'm gonna get the car. Hello? What? No, I'm not in Albuquerque right now. Okay, we'll come right home right now.
Who was that?
The house is on fire.
What?
We gotta go.
Mark's house was set on fire. Peggy knew instinctively that this was Patrick.
Mark and Peggy fly back to Albuquerque and head to the police station.
Albuquerque police was treating it as an arson. And Peggy said, "It's arson because it's involved with stalking. This man is stalking me."
It's my ex-boyfriend, Patrick. I'm sure of it.
Well, we have an open investigation, but we would need physical evidence that ties Patrick to the fire. It will take a few weeks at least.
Weeks? And what are we supposed to do until then? He's not gonna stop until he's ruined our lives. I'm scared he's gonna kill me.
There must be something you can do.
I tell you what. Keep a detailed record of everything he's done or is doing. Let's see if we can make a case on stalking. Then and only then can I do anything.
It's okay. We'll work on it together.
Peggy had been very honest and very upfront with Mark about having a stalker. And Mark said, I'm in it for the long haul. I don't think that he knew how bad it was going to get. I don't think either of them knew how bad it was going to get.
With Mark's help, Peggy spends countless hours building her case against Patrick.
That's when Peggy began to keep every piece of evidence. She had been keeping all her cell phone records, from that point on. She kept a copy of the flyer. She kept pieces from the arson investigation.
Okay, this is a completely separate report. That you've got the arson.
The phone records and the arson report right here.
The jealousy, the following, the obsession, these aren't idle threats, and they shouldn't be seen that way. You don't have to read between the lines, just read the lines, and it would have told you this woman was in danger.
And the next time Peggy pays a visit to police, she brings concrete proof of Patrick's ongoing harassment with her.
You have to have probable cause to make an arrest, but the officer has to create that case to make probable cause. And in this case, they didn't. She had made the probable cause for her case. She built the case. She had it in hand when she walked in to the police station.
Here is everything you asked for.
She told him she was in danger and all the things that he was doing to her. This man was determined, which meant the police should have been determined as well. He was not just sitting at a computer screen sending threatening messages. That's bad enough. He was actively, physically spending time to stalk Peggy and Mark.
Armed with the evidence to back up her claims, Peggy files stalking charges against Patrick. Police arrest Patrick, but after he makes bail, Peggy decides that as long as Patrick remains a free man, she must take action to protect herself.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you all for a wonderful class. Just a quick announcement. Just wanted to let you know that today will be my last class, and Jasmine from the Friday class will be taking over my morning classes.
Wait, where are you going?
It's just time for me to move on for a bit, explore new horizons.
She was awaiting trial that was to happen in September, but they kept pushing it back. And so at this point, Peggy and Mark decided, let's get her out of Albuquerque because Patrick won't be able to find her.
So, you never did give me that chance to take you out.
You're a sweet guy, James. You're gonna make some woman very happy someday.
Where are you going?
It's a secret.
Well, I can keep a secret.
I'll bet you can.
Look, I've been coming to your class for 3 years now. You can tell me where you're going.
A small town in California, but that's all you get.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. And, maybe our paths will cross again.
It seemed to me that she made the assessment that she wasn't going to get protection from her police, so she fled. That act in itself was evidence, how she felt about how much danger she and Mark both were in.
With Mark's support, Peggy relocates almost 1,000 miles away to Turlock, California, and moves into a small, undisclosed apartment by herself.
Mark helped her get a job as a pharmaceutical sales rep. She just basically covered her tracks as well as she could, so no one would find her.
But as Peggy waits for her trial to begin, the fear of Patrick is never far from her mind.
I think up to that point, she'd done everything she was supposed to do. She filed the restraining order. She got out of Albuquerque. She got away from him. But Patrick was always kind of looming. Like, there was always kind of this dark cloud. In the back of her mind, she felt like somehow he's gonna find her. Somehow he's not gonna stop.
"31-year-old Peggy Klinke moves from New Mexico to California to escape her stalker ex-boyfriend Patrick Kennedy, but he continues to haunt her.
Hey,
Hey, everything okay?
I think I'm going crazy. It feels like every car is following me.
At this point in Peggy's life, we're going on 11 months of being a stalking victim.
Peggy, you just need to relax and breathe, okay?
No one knows where you are.
Maybe you could find a place to do some yoga again.
I'll try to do that after work. Thank you.
The stalking trial, which was originally to happen in September, was moved to October and now is moved to mid to late January. I could see this was wearing her down. She was in fear every moment of every day.
And one day, Peggy's worst fears come true.
He was persistent and he found her. He did it with a private investigator, which also says how determined he was.
You think you can leave me?
He decided to attack, and there was no one there to protect her.
As Peggy fights for her life, a neighbor pays her a visit.
He found me. What's going on? My ex, he's gonna kill me. No. Come to my house. Come to my house. Go. The closet.
From there, Peggy had bought some time. She was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and hit me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he said. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it now. Does he have a gun right now? He already beat my head. If you don't get here, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now.
He's in the house. He's gonna kill us. Please get here. Please.
You need to leave now.
Now!
Hang that up.
Please. Stop it. Female. Please stop it. I think he's going to kill me. Is he? Ma'am?
At this point, the SWAT team arrives, and there's an officer standing outside of the door.
Patrick Kennedy, come out with your hands up.
He's trying to talk to Patrick. Patrick won't engage.
No!
Peggy, can you hear me?
Please don't come in. He's got a gun. He'll kill me if you try.
At this point, I think Peggy surrenders. She's very calm.
Officer, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Officer, can you do 3 things for me?
We're going to get you out of there, Peggy. Just hold on.
Can you please tell my mother that I love her? Can you please tell my nieces that they're gonna have a guardian angel in heaven? Can you tell my sister Debbie to name her baby after me?
Stay with me, Peggy.
Patrick shot Peggy in the head, and then he shot himself in the head.
Most stalking cases seem to escalate in lethality, just as domestic violence cases do when the victim leaves the offender. And that is a very, very unfortunate paradigm that you see in stalking investigations. And Mr. Kennedy certainly showed that textbook style.
She exhibited she was in fear. She had the evidence of the stalking case. I don't know what else she could have done other than what she had done. And with all that, the law still failed her.
We did not get the news in Ohio until Saturday evening. My mom and I were sitting in the living room watching TV, and the doorbell rang. What I saw at the front door was 2 police officers. And at the first sight of those officers, I knew my sister was dead. I wasn't surprised that this is how the road ended for her, since nobody would do anything to protect her.
Debbie called me, and it's like I knew as soon as she said, "This is Peggy's sister." I knew something had happened. And I just remember like screaming and crying. It's like, why kill her? But I think even in the end, he thought she belonged to him. And if he couldn't have her, no one could.
In the wake of her sister's senseless murder, Debbie honors Peggy by channeling her grief into action and awareness.
I began traveling with the Stalking Resource Center and telling Peggy's story at law enforcement and criminal justice trainings. I now work with college campuses where we see a huge, huge population of stalking victims. It's a very painful story to tell, but I know in the 16 years that I've been telling it that it has made a huge difference in many lives. There were so many things that I want Peggy remembered for. I think the most beautiful part about this story is that Patrick tried to do away with her to get her to shut up. And more people know Peggy now than they ever did before. Her beautiful spirit and her legacy will continue to live on.
The phone rang in the middle of the night, but no one answered. Outside, Houston was quiet beneath the December darkness. The city was still growing, still spreading outward, its streets carrying the ordinary traffic of people going home, people working late, people believing that tomorrow would look much like today. Inside one modest home, however, a young mother named Diane Maxwell Jackson had disappeared from the world. She was 25 years old. She was a single mother. She worked for Southwestern Bell as a telephone operator, a job built around voices. Every day, Diane connected strangers to one another. She listened to ringing phones. She answered calls. She moved unseen conversations across the city. But on December 14th, 1969, it was Diane's own voice that would vanish. And for decades, the question would remain brutally simple. Who killed her? The answer would eventually emerge from something almost invisible. A fingerprint. But in 1969, nobody knew that yet. At the time, investigators were staring into a case with almost no clear direction, trying to understand how a young woman could be murdered and how the person responsible could simply disappear. Diane had a daughter. She had a job. She had a life that, from the outside, seemed ordinary. And then, suddenly, she was gone. Houston in the late 1960s was a city changing rapidly. Freeways were expanding. New neighborhoods were appearing. Industry was booming. Thousands of people moved through the city every day, often without knowing one another. It was the kind of place where a stranger could cross paths with someone once and never be remembered. That anonymity would become important, because Diane's killer did not leave behind a confession. He did not leave a name. He did not leave an obvious trail pointing investigators toward his identity. Instead, he left something much smaller. Something that could wait. Something that could survive for decades. On the morning of December 14th, Diane was found dead. The discovery immediately transformed an ordinary Houston neighborhood into a crime scene. Police arrived. Questions followed. Where had Diane been? Who had last seen her alive? Who had spoken with her? Was she targeted? Was the killing planned? Or had something gone terribly wrong in a brief encounter? Investigators began reconstructing the final hours of her life. Every detail mattered. Her movements. Her vehicle. Her possessions. The people she knew. The places she had visited. The physical evidence left behind. But the investigation was taking place in another era. There were no modern DNA databases capable of instantly searching millions of profiles. There were no smartphones recording locations. No digital surveillance network followed vehicles through the city. No automated system could connect a fingerprint recovered at a crime scene with a suspect living hundreds of miles away. For detectives in 1969, forensic evidence was powerful. But it had limits. And one piece of evidence would become the silent witness that refused to disappear. A fingerprint was recovered from Diane's car. At first, it was simply an unidentified print. A ridge pattern. A series of tiny lines. A mark left by a human hand. Investigators documented it. They preserved it. They searched what they could search. But there was no immediate name attached to it. No suspect emerged. The print could tell investigators that someone had touched the vehicle. It could not tell them why. It could not tell them where that person was. And it could not tell them whether the person connected to the print was responsible for Diane's death. The case stalled. Years passed. Then more years. The world changed around it. The Houston of 1969 became a memory. The technology of criminal investigation transformed. Old case files remained in storage. Evidence remained evidence. And Diane's name remained connected to a murder that had never received an answer. For Diane's family, however, there was nothing abstract about a cold case. There was no passage of time when a missing answer became less painful. Her daughter grew older. The investigators who had worked the original case aged. Some retired. Some died. The people who remembered the first days of the investigation gradually became fewer. But the evidence remained. And somewhere inside the machinery of law enforcement, Diane's case waited. The decades created a strange contradiction. The murder became older. The evidence did not. A fingerprint recovered in 1969 could still be examined in 2003. And that difference between human memory and physical evidence would eventually change everything. By the beginning of the 21st century, forensic science had entered a different age. Technology had transformed the way investigators searched for suspects. Fingerprints could be digitized. Databases could be searched far more efficiently. Old evidence could be re-examined with tools unavailable to detectives decades earlier. Cold cases that had once seemed permanently frozen were beginning to move. Diane's case was one of them. Investigators returned to the evidence. They looked again. And this time, the unidentified fingerprint from Diane's vehicle was no longer just a meaningless pattern. It produced a name. James Ray Davis. The discovery was explosive. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally had a person whose fingerprint connected him to Diane's vehicle. But a fingerprint was not the same thing as a confession. It was not, by itself, the complete story. Detectives still had to ask the most important question. Why was James Ray Davis's fingerprint there? Who was he? What was his connection to Diane? And what happened on that December night more than 30 years earlier? The investigation suddenly moved backward through time. Detectives examined Davis's history. They revisited the circumstances surrounding Diane's death. They looked at the evidence again, this time through the lens of a possible suspect. For the first time in decades, the cold case had warmth. A name had appeared. A face could be attached to the mystery. But the distance between a fingerprint and a murder conviction was enormous. Davis eventually became the focus of investigators. And then came the moment every cold case detective waits for. The suspect talked. James Ray Davis confessed to killing Diane. The confession transformed the case. For 34 years, the murder had existed as an unanswered question. Now there was an admission from the man investigators believed responsible. Davis would eventually receive a life sentence. The case that had begun in Houston in 1969 had finally reached a courtroom. But the resolution carried a disturbing lesson. Diane's killer had not been caught because someone suddenly remembered the right detail. He had not been identified because a forgotten witness walked into a police station decades later. He was found because a tiny piece of evidence had survived. A fingerprint. A mark created in a moment that nobody thought would matter 34 years later. That is what makes the Diane Maxwell Jackson case so haunting. The killer left. The years passed. The city changed. But the evidence stayed behind. And while the people involved in the original investigation could do little more than wait, the fingerprint remained locked inside the case, holding a secret that technology would eventually be capable of revealing. In 1969, that print had no voice. In 2003, it finally spoke. Diane had been 25. Her daughter had been left without her mother. A family had been forced to live with an unanswered question for more than 3 decades. And somewhere in Houston, a murder that had once dominated investigators' attention had gradually become one of the city's forgotten cold cases. Until someone looked again. That second look changed everything. Because cold cases are built on a cruel illusion. Time makes people believe that the past is gone. But evidence does not experience time the way people do. A fingerprint does not forget. A photograph does not forget. A piece of clothing does not forget. A record does not forget. And sometimes, the smallest object inside an old evidence file can wait longer than anyone expects. Diane's case waited 34 years. 34 years of silence. 34 years without an answer. 34 years during which the person responsible remained outside a prison cell. Then, almost impossibly, the past returned. Not as a rumor. Not as a theory. Not as an old newspaper headline. It returned as a fingerprint match to a living man. And suddenly, the murder of a young telephone operator in Houston was no longer a mystery without a face. It had a suspect. It had a confession. And after more than 3 decades, it finally had justice. The name James Ray Davis changed the shape of the investigation. For 34 years, Diane Maxwell Jackson's murder had existed in the darkest category of criminal investigation. A case with a victim, a crime scene, physical evidence, and no identified killer. The file had survived while almost everything else around it changed. Investigators changed. Technology changed. Houston changed. The people who had once followed the case closely grew older. Some were gone. But Diane's name remained. And so did the fingerprint. That was a detail that made the case different from so many other unsolved murders. The killer had not vanished without leaving anything behind. He had left behind a physical trace. The problem was that, in 1969, investigators did not have the technological power to turn that trace into an identity. For decades, the fingerprint existed without a name. Then the name appeared. James Ray Davis. Suddenly, detectives had a direction. But a direction was not enough. They had to reconstruct the crime from the beginning. December 1969. Diane was 25 years old. She worked for Southwestern Bell as a telephone operator. Her job depended on precision, concentration, and communication. She was part of a system that connected people across Houston, one call at a time. Outside work, she was a mother. Her daughter depended on her. Her family knew her as a young woman with responsibilities, routines, and an ordinary life. Then that ordinary life was violently interrupted. The details of her final hours became the center of an investigation that would eventually stretch across generations. Detectives had to determine how Diane's vehicle became connected to the crime. They had to understand the significance of the fingerprint. And they had to determine whether the person who left it there was merely someone who had touched the vehicle or the man responsible for Diane's death. That distinction mattered. A fingerprint can prove contact. It does not automatically prove murder. Investigators therefore needed more. They needed the story behind the print. They needed to know where Davis had been. They needed to understand whether he knew Diane. And they needed to determine what happened between them. The passage of time made every question harder. Witness memories fade. People move. Records disappear. Relationships change. A person who remembered something in 1969 might remember it differently 30 years later. A location that once existed might no longer exist. A street could change. A building could disappear. A neighborhood could transform. But the crime itself remained fixed in time. Diane had died in 1969. Nothing could change that. The investigation, however, had to move forward. The discovery of Davis's fingerprint created an entirely new possibility. Maybe the case had never truly been dead. Maybe it had simply been waiting for the right technology. That possibility is what drives cold case investigators. They know that an unsolved murder does not necessarily mean the evidence is gone. Sometimes it means the evidence has not yet been understood. In Diane's case, the fingerprint became the bridge between two eras. One era had collected it. Another era could identify it. That gap was more than 3 decades long. By 2003, investigators had tools that detectives in 1969 could not have imagined. Digital fingerprint databases could compare prints at a scale that earlier investigators simply did not possess. The search eventually produced the match. James Ray Davis. Now the cold case had a living suspect. But investigators still had to approach him carefully. A decades-old murder could not be solved by accusation alone. They needed to confront Davis with the evidence. They needed to see his reaction. They needed to listen. And above all, they needed to establish what happened. The pressure of a 34-year-old mystery suddenly became concentrated on one man. For years, Diane's family had lived with uncertainty. Now detectives were asking whether the man connected to that fingerprint could finally explain why. The confrontation eventually produced the answer. Davis confessed. The confession was the moment the case crossed an invisible line. Before it, there was suspicion. After it, there was an admission. A murder that had remained unresolved since the late 1960s suddenly had a confession attached to it. But there is something deeply unsettling about a confession that arrives decades late. It forces investigators to look backward. It forces families to reopen memories they may have spent years trying to survive. It forces a community to remember something it had gradually learned to forget. Houston in 2003 was not the Houston Diane had known. The city had expanded. Technology had changed daily life. People communicated differently. The telephone operator job itself belonged to a different era. And yet the murder had not become less real. The victim had not become less important. Diane was still 25. Her daughter was still her daughter. The unanswered years had simply accumulated around them. For investigators, the confession helped close a question that had haunted the case. For Diane's family, however, justice could not restore what had been taken. That is one of the hardest truths about cold cases. Solving a murder does not undo the murder. An arrest does not return a mother. A conviction does not give a child back the years lost. Justice can answer a question. It cannot reverse time. And that is why the story of Diane Maxwell Jackson is more than the story of a fingerprint match. It is the story of time itself. 34 years is an extraordinary distance. Imagine taking a single event from your life and placing it at the beginning of a completely different world. The people involved are younger. The technology is different. The language is different. The city is different. The newspapers are different. Even the methods used to investigate a crime are different. Yet somewhere inside that changing world, one piece of evidence remains exactly where it was. Waiting. The fingerprint did not become stronger with age. It simply became more useful as technology improved. That distinction matters. Modern forensic science did not create the evidence. It allowed investigators to finally interpret it. The original investigators had done something important in 1969. They had preserved the physical trace. That decision became critical decades later. Without that evidence, the investigation might have remained unresolved forever. The case also reveals one of the most important principles in forensic investigation: evidence can outlive memory. A witness may forget. A suspect may deny. A family may lose details. But physical evidence can remain. That is why old evidence lockers can contain extraordinary possibilities. A case that appears empty may not actually be empty. It may contain the answer. The answer may simply be buried beneath years of technological limitation. For Diane's murder, the breakthrough came when investigators revisited what had already been collected. They did not need to invent a new clue. They needed to recognize the value of an old one. The fingerprint became the turning point. And once Davis was identified, investigators could finally connect a person to the physical evidence. The case that had once been defined by absence now had presence. A name. A suspect. A confession. A courtroom. A sentence. After decades of uncertainty, James Ray Davis was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. The result marked the end of one of Houston's long-running cold cases. But it also raised a question that remains relevant whenever an old murder is solved. How many other cases are still waiting for the same kind of second look? How many pieces of evidence are sitting inside old files? How many fingerprints were collected before modern databases existed? How many unidentified traces are still waiting for a match? How many families continue to live with questions because the technology of one generation could not interpret the evidence collected by another? Diane's case offers no easy answer. It offers something more powerful. Proof that time does not always protect a killer. For decades, the murder remained unresolved. The years might have created the illusion that the case was fading away. But underneath that silence, the evidence remained. The fingerprint was still there. And eventually, investigators found the name attached to it. James Ray Davis. Then came the confession. And the long journey toward justice finally reached its end. But there is one image that remains impossible to ignore. A young woman, 25 years old, a mother, a telephone operator, a life interrupted in December 1969. And inside the machinery of the investigation, a tiny pattern of ridges preserved from that moment. It was almost nothing. A fingerprint is fragile. It can disappear. It can be smudged. It can be overlooked. But this one survived. It survived the passage of years. It survived the death of memories. It survived changes in technology. It survived the transformation of Houston. And when investigators finally had the ability to search it properly, it pointed toward a man. The past had left a message. It simply took 34 years for anyone to read it. For Diane's family, the answer came far too late. But it came. And that distinction is the reason the case remains so haunting. For more than 3 decades, there was only one question. Who killed Diane Maxwell Jackson? Then, after 34 years of silence, the evidence answered. And the answer had a name. The answer had a name, but a name was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of the most difficult part. After 34 years, detectives were no longer chasing an unknown shadow. They were looking at a specific man and asking whether the evidence, the history, and the confession could finally explain what happened to Diane Maxwell Jackson on that December night in Houston. For investigators working the case in 2003, time was both an enemy and an ally. It had destroyed details, it had erased memories, it had changed the city, but it had also created something the detectives of 1969 never had: technology capable of searching old evidence against a vastly larger pool of fingerprints. That difference was enormous. In 1969, a fingerprint lifted from a crime scene could be carefully photographed, classified, compared, and circulated through traditional law enforcement channels. The process was painstaking. The available records were limited. If the person who left the print was not already in the system, the evidence could remain unidentified indefinitely. By 2003, the world had changed. Computers could search millions of records. Digital databases could compare patterns at extraordinary speed. Old evidence could be reconsidered. And a fingerprint that had once been an unanswered question could suddenly become a direct investigative lead. That was what happened with Diane's case. The print from her vehicle was compared against available records. The result pointed to James Ray Davis. For detectives, the discovery must have felt like the case had suddenly come alive. But cold cases do not simply solve themselves when a name appears. Every new lead creates another series of questions. Why was Davis connected to Diane's vehicle? When had he been there? What was his relationship to Diane? What did he know about her? And most importantly, what had happened between them? Investigators had to work backward through 34 years of history. That meant revisiting a murder committed before many modern investigative practices had become standard. The original case had been built with the tools available at the time. The renewed investigation had to combine those original findings with modern forensic capabilities. It was almost like opening a time capsule. Inside were the details of Diane's life, the evidence from the crime, the unanswered questions, the fingerprint, and now, finally, a name. The emotional weight of such a discovery is difficult to measure. For a detective, a cold case can become personal after enough years. Not because investigators knew the victim, but because the absence of justice becomes part of the case itself. Every year that passes creates another layer of frustration. A file remains open. A family remains without answers. A killer remains unidentified. Then one day, the phone rings. A database produces a match. The case suddenly has a direction. But there is another side to the breakthrough. For Diane's family, the appearance of a suspect could bring hope and fear at the same time. Hope that the truth might finally be known. Fear of learning what the truth actually was. For 34 years, uncertainty had allowed the mind to imagine possibilities. Now the investigation was narrowing toward one explanation. James Ray Davis, the man whose fingerprint had been recovered from Diane's vehicle, the man investigators would eventually confront, and the man who would eventually confess. The confession transformed the meaning of the old evidence. Before the confession, the fingerprint established a connection. After the confession, that connection existed alongside an admission of responsibility. The mystery was no longer simply forensic. It was human. Someone had known what happened to Diane all those years. Someone had carried that knowledge through decades while Diane's family continued living with the consequences. That realization is one of the darkest elements of any cold case. A victim's last moments may become a permanent mystery to everyone else, while the person responsible may carry the truth alone. Years can pass. Children grow up. Families move. Cities change. The killer grows older. But the secret remains. In Diane's case, the secret eventually came out. The investigation moved toward prosecution. The legal system now had to take evidence collected in one era and present it in another. The fingerprint mattered. The confession mattered. The history mattered. And the passage of time itself became part of the story. Diane had been killed in 1969. Davis was not identified until 2003. More than 3 decades separated the crime from the breakthrough. That is an extraordinary span in any murder investigation. 34 years is long enough for an entire generation to grow up. A child who was alive when Diane died could become an adult with children of their own. A teenager in Houston in 1969 could become a grandparent by the time the suspect was finally identified. The city could change almost beyond recognition. Yet the murder remained fixed. It had happened once. The evidence had been preserved once. And the truth, buried beneath years of silence, had remained waiting. That is what makes the fingerprints so important. It was not merely a clue. It was a connection between 2 worlds. The world in which Diane was alive, and the world in which investigators finally identified the man responsible for her death. One tiny pattern of ridges crossed that 34-year gap. There is something almost unsettling about the simplicity of it. A human hand touched a surface. That contact lasted only seconds. The person moved away. The world continued. But the mark remained. And decades later, that mark became evidence. This is why forensic evidence can be so powerful. It does not depend entirely on memory. It does not need a person to remember exactly what they saw. It does not grow older in the same way a witness does. A fingerprint has no emotions, no fear, no loyalty, no reason to lie. It simply records contact. The challenge is interpreting what that contact means. In Diane's case, investigators eventually had the additional information needed to understand it. The suspect was identified. He confessed. The legal process followed, and the long-running investigation finally reached a conclusion. But the story did not end when the courtroom door closed. Because justice is not the same thing as closure. Those 2 words are often used together, but they are not identical. Justice means the person responsible is held accountable under the law. Closure is more complicated. A mother does not return because a murderer receives a sentence. A daughter does not get her childhood back. A family cannot recover 34 years. The calendar does not reverse itself. That is the cruel arithmetic of murder. One moment can destroy decades of lives, and no sentence can completely restore what was lost. Still, accountability matters. 4 years, Diane's murder had existed without it. The person responsible was not in prison for the crime. The family did not have the full answer. The case remained one of those old files that seemed destined to become another forgotten chapter in Houston's criminal history. Then forensic science reopened the door. The investigation also demonstrated why cold cases should not automatically be treated as dead cases. A case can be inactive without being impossible. Evidence can remain viable. Technology can improve. Databases can expand. Investigators can revisit old assumptions. A detail dismissed as insignificant decades earlier can become decisive. That is exactly what happened here. The evidence had been waiting longer than the people who originally collected it could have imagined. When detectives returned to the case, they were not beginning from nothing. They were inheriting the work of investigators who had come before them. The original officers had documented the crime. They had preserved evidence. They had created a record. Their investigation had reached a dead end, but the evidence itself had not disappeared. That distinction ultimately made the difference. Diane's murder was not solved because the past suddenly changed. It was solved because investigators finally had the tools to understand part of the past. And once Davis was identified, the decades of silence began to collapse. The suspect had a name. The evidence had a match. The investigators had a direction. Then came the confession. After that, the case that had haunted Diane's family for decades moved toward its final legal chapter. James Ray Davis would be sentenced to life in prison. The long wait was over. But even after the sentence, the image of Diane remained. A 25-year-old woman whose life should have continued. A mother whose daughter should have had decades more with her. A telephone operator whose profession was built around connecting people, yet whose own story became defined by an absence no phone call could repair. Her case reminds us that behind every cold case headline is a human life. Not a file number. Not a fingerprint. Not a database entry. A person. Diane had plans. She had responsibilities. She had people who loved her. She had a future. That future disappeared in December 1969. For the next 34 years, her murder remained unanswered. Then a fingerprint from her vehicle became the thread investigators could finally pull. And once they pulled it, the entire old mystery began to unravel. The name James Ray Davis no longer belonged only to a database. It became connected to a woman whose family had waited decades for an answer. The past had finally caught up with the present. And for the first time since Diane's death, investigators could say something they had been unable to say for most of her daughter's life. They knew who was responsible. The silence had been broken. But the question that remained was far more haunting. What exactly happened during the final hours of Diane Maxwell Jackson's life? The fingerprint could identify a man. The confession could establish responsibility. But behind those facts was a young woman's final journey through Houston, a sequence of moments that ended in violence and left a family waiting more than 3 decades for the truth. And somewhere inside the surviving evidence was the story of those final moments. The investigators only had to reconstruct it. By the time investigators returned to Diane Maxwell Jackson's case in 2003, the crime had become almost impossible to imagine in its original form. 34 years had passed. The Houston Diane had known was gone. The roads had changed. Buildings had changed. Technology had changed. Even the way investigators thought about evidence had changed. But the murder itself remained exactly where it had always been. December 1969. A young woman. A vehicle. A crime scene. And one unidentified fingerprint waiting inside the evidence. The breakthrough began with that print, but investigators still had to reconstruct the circumstances surrounding Diane's death. The fingerprint could place James Ray Davis in contact with her vehicle. The confession could eventually provide the missing connection. But before the confession, there was a much larger puzzle. Who was Diane? And why did her life end? Those questions mattered because victims in cold cases can gradually become reduced to a name in an old file. Investigators must fight against that. A murder investigation is not simply an attempt to identify a perpetrator. It is an attempt to reconstruct the life that was taken and understand the circumstances that led to its destruction. Diane was 25. She was a mother. She worked for Southwestern Bell. Her job placed her inside the enormous communications network of Houston, where voices traveled through wires and strangers were connected by operators who often remained invisible to the people they helped. There was something almost symbolic about that profession. Diane spent her working life connecting people. Yet after her death, the people who loved her were left disconnected from the truth. For decades, they had no answer. The original investigation had followed the evidence available at the time. Detectives documented what they could. They examined Diane's vehicle. They collected physical evidence. And somewhere within that process, the fingerprint was preserved. But a fingerprint without a database match can become a frustrating object. It proves that someone touched something. It does not tell investigators when. It does not automatically reveal why. And it does not announce the identity of the person who left it. The print had to wait. That waiting period lasted longer than anyone could have expected. As the years passed, Diane's murder became a cold case. The phrase sounds clinical. Cold case. 2 words. But there is nothing cold about the grief inside one. A cold case means the investigation has stopped producing answers. It does not mean the victim has been forgotten. For families, time does not erase the central question. What happened? Who did it? Why? Could it have been prevented? Could the person responsible have been caught sooner? These questions can remain for decades. Then, in 2003, the fingerprint finally produced a lead. James Ray Davis. The name changed the investigation immediately. Detectives now had someone to investigate. They could examine his history. They could compare the known evidence with what they learned about him. And they could attempt to understand his connection to Diane. But the investigators were working with a problem that every cold case detective understands. The past does not cooperate. People remember selectively. Documents disappear. Witnesses die. Places change. Stories evolve. A person can live an entirely different life by the time investigators come knocking decades later. And yet, despite all those obstacles, the case began moving. Davis became the focus. The evidence connected him to Diane's vehicle. Investigators had the fingerprint. They had the old case file. They had the murder. Now they needed the truth. Eventually, Davis confessed. That confession was the moment the decades-long uncertainty finally began to collapse. But imagine the significance of that moment. For investigators, it meant the cold case had finally been solved. For Diane's family, it meant something far more complicated. For 34 years, the killer had existed as an unknown figure. There had been no face, no confirmed name, no definitive explanation. Now there was one. The person responsible had been identified, and the legal system could finally hold him accountable. Davis ultimately received a life sentence. The case had reached its conclusion. Yet the route to that conclusion revealed something important about the nature of criminal investigation. Sometimes the most important evidence is not the newest evidence. Sometimes it is the oldest. The fingerprint that helped identify Davis had been collected during the original investigation. Nothing about the fingerprint itself had changed. The technology around it had changed. That distinction is critical. Forensic science is often portrayed as a world of spectacular discoveries. Advanced DNA analysis, digital reconstruction, artificial intelligence, massive databases, sophisticated laboratory techniques. But sometimes the breakthrough begins with something incredibly simple. A print, a photograph, a trace, a piece of evidence sitting quietly in a file. The difference between an unsolved murder and a solved murder can be the ability to interpret something investigators already possessed. Diane's case became an example of that principle. The evidence had survived. The case had survived. And eventually, the technology caught up. There is another reason the case is so unsettling. The murderer did not need to leave behind a dramatic clue. There was no cinematic message, no elaborate confession waiting to be discovered, no obvious trail. The decisive connection came from something ordinary. A hand touching a vehicle. That simple act became the link between Diane and the man who would eventually be convicted for her murder. A person can leave a room. A person can leave a city. A person can change their name. A person can deny what happened. But a fingerprint remains a physical record of contact. And when investigators finally had a database capable of finding its owner, the silence began to break. The discovery also illustrates how unpredictable time can be in criminal investigations. For 34 years, the case appeared frozen. Then, suddenly it moved. One day there was no suspect. Then there was a name. One day there was only an unidentified print. Then there was a match. One day the murder existed as an unanswered question. Then there was a confession. The transformation was extraordinary. But it was not magic. It was the result of evidence preservation, technological advancement, and investigators willing to reopen a case that had remained unresolved for decades. That willingness matters. Cold cases require patience. They require detectives to accept that the answer may be hidden inside information that previous generations could not use. They require a willingness to ask the same question differently. What did we miss? What can we test again? What technology exists now that did not exist then? What evidence is still available? Diane's case answered those questions with one of the most fundamental tools in forensic identification: fingerprints. The ridge patterns on a human hand are unique, but their value depends on comparison. Without a known print to compare against, an unidentified print may remain unidentified. Modern databases change that equation. A print could be searched against enormous collections of records. The odds of finding a match became dramatically greater. And in Diane's case, the search produced Davis. The case that had been buried for more than 3 decades was suddenly active again. The investigation then moved from evidence to confrontation. Davis was questioned. The evidence was presented. And eventually, he confessed. There is a strange finality to a confession after 34 years. For decades, Diane's family had lived with uncertainty. Now the uncertainty had been replaced by a terrible certainty. The answer was not comforting. It could never be. But it was an answer. Davis would face the consequences. He would receive a life sentence. And Diane's murder would no longer be classified as an unsolved mystery. Still, there remained the emotional reality of the victim. Diane did not live to see the investigation solved. She did not know that her fingerprint evidence would survive. She did not know that technology would eventually identify her killer. She did not know that the man responsible would one day stand before the justice system. All of that happened after her death. Her story was carried forward by investigators, evidence, and the people who refused to let the case disappear. That is the hidden strength of a cold case. A victim may be silent, but the investigation can continue speaking for them. Evidence can speak. Records can speak. Forensic science can speak. And eventually, the truth can emerge. Diane's story also demonstrates why time does not necessarily erase accountability. 34 years can seem like an impossible distance. But the law can wait. Evidence can wait. And sometimes justice can wait. The case began in an era when telephone operators physically connected calls and fingerprints were examined largely by hand. It reached its breakthrough in an era of computerized forensic databases. 2 completely different worlds. One murder. One piece of evidence connecting them. The fingerprint was the bridge. And on the other side of that bridge was James Ray Davis. The man who had remained unidentified for decades. The man whose identity investigators eventually uncovered. The man who confessed. The man who would receive a life sentence. The case was finally closed. But closure did not erase the questions that surrounded Diane's final moments. It did not erase the image of a 25-year-old mother whose life ended far too soon. It did not erase the years her daughter spent without her. It did not erase the silence that had surrounded the investigation. It simply meant that the silence finally had an answer. For 34 years, the fingerprint waited. Then technology gave it a voice. And once that voice was heard, investigators were able to follow it directly to a name. James Ray Davis. That name would become permanently connected to Diane Maxwell Jackson. But before the case could finally be closed, investigators had to confront the most difficult part of all. The evidence could tell them who had been connected to Diane's vehicle. The confession could tell them who was responsible. But the full story of the crime required something more. It required reconstructing the sequence of events that led a young mother from an ordinary December night to a murder that would haunt Houston for more than 3 decades. And as investigators revisited the old evidence, the darkness surrounding Diane's final hours began to take shape. The darkness surrounding Diane Maxwell Jackson's final hours had lasted for more than 3 decades. But by 2003, investigators were finally able to look at the old case through a different lens. The question was no longer simply who had killed Diane. They knew the name: James Ray Davis. The harder question was how the pieces fit together. A murder investigation is built from fragments: a vehicle, a fingerprint, a witness statement, a photograph, a report written by an officer who may have retired decades earlier. Each fragment may appear insignificant by itself, but when investigators place those fragments beside one another, a sequence begins to emerge. That sequence was what detectives were trying to reconstruct. Diane was not an anonymous figure. She was a 25-year-old mother. She worked as a telephone operator for Southwestern Bell. Her life was rooted in ordinary responsibilities: work, family, her daughter, the daily routines that make a person's existence seem predictable. Then came December 14th, 1969. The day began like countless others. Houston was moving through the final weeks of the year. Christmas was approaching. Families were preparing for the holiday season. Businesses were operating. Traffic moved through the city. Telephone lines carried conversations between homes and offices. Nobody looking at Diane's life from the outside could have known that her story was about to end. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of homicide. The victim usually does not know which ordinary moment will become the final ordinary moment. There is no warning bell. No headline announcing that this is the last morning. No voice saying, "Remember this." Life simply continues. Until it doesn't. When Diane was found dead, the normal rhythm of the city was interrupted. Police began documenting the scene. The investigation immediately became a search for explanations. Who had been near Diane? Who had access to her? Who had entered or touched her vehicle? What circumstances led to her death? And why? The vehicle became particularly important because investigators recovered a fingerprint from it. At the time, the print had no obvious identity. That meant investigators had a physical connection to an unknown person. But an unidentified fingerprint can create as many questions as it answers. Was the person known to Diane? Was the contact innocent? Was it connected directly to the murder? Could the person have touched the vehicle before the killing? Could the print have been left during an ordinary encounter? The evidence could not answer those questions by itself. It simply waited. For investigators in 1969, the case was a race against uncertainty. Every day without an identification made the investigation more difficult. Every passing week meant memories could fade. Every passing month increased the possibility that the killer might disappear into ordinary life. And eventually, the investigation lost momentum. The case became cold. That phrase can make a murder sound as though it has stopped existing. But a murder does not stop existing. The victim does not stop being dead. The family does not stop remembering. The unanswered questions do not disappear. only the investigation slows. And in Diane's case, it slowed for decades. The evidence remained behind. So did the case file. What changed was the world. The technology available to police in 1969 had been replaced by increasingly sophisticated systems. Fingerprint identification moved from physical filing systems toward computerized searches. The implications were enormous. A print that might once have required a known suspect could now be compared against huge databases. Instead of asking, "Does this print belong to this person?" investigators could ask a much larger question. Who does this print belong to? That was the question that ultimately changed Diane's case. The old fingerprint was searched. The system produced a match. James Ray Davis. The discovery transformed the investigation from a search for an unknown killer into an investigation of a known individual. But detectives still had to be cautious. A forensic match creates a lead. It does not eliminate the need for corroboration. The investigators had to establish the circumstances. They needed to know whether Davis's connection to Diane's vehicle made sense. They needed to examine the history. They needed to understand what happened in 1969. And they needed to see whether Davis would explain the connection. The interview became crucial. After 34 years, investigators were sitting across from a man whose fingerprint had been found in connection with the murder of a young Houston mother. Imagine the weight of that confrontation. For Davis, the case belonged to the distant past. For investigators, it had suddenly become present. For Diane's family, it had never truly been past. That difference is one of the defining characteristics of cold cases. The passage of time is not experienced equally by everyone. For the killer, decades can mean an entire lifetime. For the victim's family, decades can mean decades of unanswered questions. And for investigators, reopening an old case means entering a world that no longer exists. The detective must become a historian. They must reconstruct a city, reconstruct relationships, reconstruct movements, reconstruct technology, reconstruct the victim's life. Then they must determine where the suspect fits. Davis's fingerprint provided the first major connection. But investigators needed more than a pattern of ridges. They needed his words. Eventually, those words came. Davis confessed to killing Diane. The confession was the turning point that the case had been waiting for. The fingerprint had opened the door. The confession allowed investigators to walk through it. The decades of uncertainty suddenly had an endpoint. But the confession also changed the emotional character of the case. A cold case can allow people to imagine that the truth is unknowable. Maybe the killer was dead. Maybe the killer had left Houston. Maybe the evidence had been destroyed. Maybe the case would never be solved. Then, suddenly, the impossible happens. The person responsible is identified. And that means the truth was never truly gone. It had simply been hidden. For Diane's daughter, the development carried enormous significance. She had lost her mother as a child. By the time investigators identified Davis, she was an adult. Her entire life had unfolded in the shadow of a murder committed when she was young. Birthdays, school years, adolescence, adulthood. All of those years existed alongside an unanswered question. Who had taken her mother away? The eventual answer could not give Diane back. But it could end the uncertainty. That distinction matters. Families of homicide victims often live with two separate wounds. The first is the loss itself. The second is the absence of an explanation. When a case is solved, the first wound remains. The second can finally begin to close. Diane's case had carried that second wound for 34 years. Then forensic science cut through it. The fingerprint had become the bridge between the original investigation and the modern investigation. Without that bridge, Davis might never have been identified. And that is why the case is an important example of the value of preserving old evidence. The investigators of 1969 could not know what technology would exist in 2003. They could not know that a fingerprint collected during their investigation would one day be searched through computerized systems. They could not know that the unknown print would eventually produce a name. But they preserved it. That decision mattered. The case also demonstrates something uncomfortable about criminal justice. Sometimes solving a murder is not about discovering a spectacular new clue. Sometimes it is about refusing to discard the old ones. A piece of evidence can appear useless for years. Then technology changes. Databases grow. Methods improve. The same evidence becomes powerful. The fingerprint did not become more valuable because it changed. It became more valuable because investigators finally had the ability to compare it. The case moved forward. Davis faced the legal consequences. He was sentenced to life in prison. And the murder of Diane Maxwell Jackson was no longer unsolved. But justice arriving 34 years late carries its own weight. There is no sentence capable of reproducing the lost years. No courtroom can recreate Diane's future. No verdict can return a mother to her daughter. The best the justice system can do is establish responsibility and impose consequences. In that sense, the sentence represented accountability. Not restoration. Accountability. The difference is important. Because Diane's life had been taken in a single act of violence. The investigation had taken 34 years. Her killer's punishment came decades after the crime. That imbalance can never be corrected. But it can be acknowledged. And perhaps that is one reason Diane's story continues to matter. Her name survived. Her case survived. The evidence survived. And eventually, the truth survived too. The murder had begun as a mystery. It became a cold case. Then a fingerprint match transformed it into an active investigation. A suspect was identified. A confession followed. And a life sentence brought the legal process to an end. But for investigators, the most important lesson was not simply that Davis had been found. It was that the case had never truly been empty. The answer had been sitting inside it, waiting. A fingerprint from a vehicle. A mark left decades earlier. A fragment of the past. And when investigators finally searched it with modern technology, the fragment became a name. James Ray Davis. That name became the key to unlocking the mystery that had surrounded Diane's murder since 1969. The city had changed. The technology had changed. The people had changed. But the evidence had remained. And in the end, it was the evidence that refused to forget. For 34 years, Diane Maxwell Jackson's murder had been a question. Then, suddenly, it became an answer. But answers create another responsibility. Once investigators knew who was responsible, they had to prove the case. They had to make the evidence withstand scrutiny. They had to transform an old fingerprint and a decades-old confession into a final legal conclusion. And that meant taking a case born in 1969 and bringing it into a courtroom more than 3 decades later. The past was no longer simply being remembered. It was being prosecuted. By the time the case reached its final legal chapter, the murder of Diane Maxwell Jackson had already become a story about time, evidence, and persistence. But the courtroom required something more than an old mystery finally producing a name. It required proof. It required investigators to demonstrate that the evidence connecting James Ray Davis to Diane was not simply an unexplained coincidence from a distant past, but part of a chain leading back to the murder itself. The case had begun in 1969, but the courtroom existed in a completely different era. The original investigators had worked without the technology that would eventually solve the case. They had gathered physical evidence. They had documented the scene. They had preserved the fingerprint. Then the investigation stalled. Decades later, detectives inherited that work. They did not have the luxury of starting from the beginning. They had to start from what remained. That meant the old evidence became central. A fingerprint recovered from Diane's vehicle had been unidentified for decades. modern technology finally connected it to James Ray Davis. That match gave investigators a name. But the name had to be placed inside the larger story. The question was no longer simply, whose fingerprint is this? It was, why was this man's fingerprint connected to Diane's vehicle, and what does that connection tell us about the murder? That is where forensic evidence becomes both powerful and limited. A fingerprint can establish contact. The investigator must establish context. The context came from the case itself. Diane had been murdered. Her vehicle was part of the surviving evidence. The fingerprint belonged to Davis. And when investigators confronted him, he confessed. The combination changed everything. A forensic match alone might have generated a question. A confession provided an explanation. Together, they formed the basis for the renewed prosecution. For the detectives who worked the case decades after the murder, this was more than an identification. It was the completion of an investigation that had been interrupted by time. They were effectively standing at the end of a road that began in 1969. The road had been long. Too long. But it had finally led somewhere. Diane's name could now be connected to a specific person. James Ray Davis would face the legal consequences of the crime. The sentence would eventually be life in prison. The case, once considered a cold case, would become a solved homicide. But the journey toward that point reveals something important about how cold cases are actually solved. Popular culture often portrays forensic breakthroughs as sudden moments. A scientist places an object under a microscope. A computer flashes a name. A detective realizes the killer's identity. In reality, cold case investigations are usually slower. They depend on patience. They depend on old records. They depend on evidence preservation. They depend on people willing to examine material that may have been untouched for years. And they depend on technology that may not even exist when the original crime occurs. Diane's case contained all of those elements. The original investigators preserved the evidence. Later investigators revisited it. Technology allowed the fingerprint to be searched. The search produced Davis. Investigators confronted him. He confessed. The justice system imposed a sentence. Each step depended on the previous one. Remove the fingerprint, and the breakthrough may never happen. Remove the original documentation, and investigators may never understand the significance of the evidence. Remove the willingness to reopen the case, and the fingerprint may remain unidentified forever. This is why cold cases can remain alive for decades. The investigation may stop moving, but the evidence remains part of the historical record. And history can change when new technology becomes available. For Diane's family, however, this was not a forensic experiment. It was personal. Her daughter had lived through decades without knowing who was responsible for her mother's death. That uncertainty can become part of a person's identity. It follows them through childhood, then adolescence, then adulthood. The question may not be spoken every day, but it remains. Who did this? Why? Will we ever know? For decades, there was no answer. Then investigators came back with a name. James Ray Davis. The emotional impact of that moment is difficult to separate from the legal significance. The identification meant that Diane's family no longer had to imagine an unknown killer. They knew. The truth was painful. But uncertainty had finally ended. And that is why solving a cold case is never as simple as closing a file. A file can be closed with a stroke of a pen. A family cannot be closed. Memory cannot be closed. Grief cannot be closed. The justice system can establish responsibility. It can impose punishment. But it cannot erase the consequences of the crime. Diane had been 25. Her life should have contained decades that never happened. Her daughter should have known her as an adult. There should have been future conversations, birthdays, family events, ordinary arguments, ordinary laughter, ordinary days. All of those possibilities disappeared with Diane. The sentence given to Davis could not restore them. But it could establish something the case had lacked for 34 years. Accountability. The state could finally say that the person responsible had been identified and punished. That matters. Because an unsolved murder leaves an open question not only about who committed the crime, but whether the system can ever catch the person responsible. Diane's case demonstrated that even after decades, the answer can sometimes be yes. The breakthrough also demonstrated the importance of fingerprint evidence. Fingerprints were not new in 1969. Investigators already understood their value. What had changed was the ability to search them. A fingerprint database can transform the nature of an investigation. Instead of manually comparing one print against a limited collection, investigators can use computerized systems to search enormous numbers of records. The technology does not replace the detective. It gives the detective a larger field of vision. In Diane's case, that expanded vision was decisive. A fingerprint that had once represented an unknown person could now be linked to Davis. That link brought the investigation back to life. And once the case was active, investigators could pursue the human story behind the forensic evidence. That human story was devastating. A young mother was dead. Her daughter had been left behind. A family waited. And the man responsible had remained unidentified for decades. The passage of time did not reduce the seriousness of the crime. It simply made the investigation harder. The eventual confession provided an important final piece. The suspect was not merely identified through a database. He acknowledged responsibility. The case moved toward a legal resolution. And James Ray Davis received a life sentence. For investigators, the result represented the end of an extraordinary journey. For Diane's family, it represented something different. An answer. After 34 years, they could finally stop asking who had killed her. The answer could not heal everything, but it could end the uncertainty. There is a particular kind of suffering created by an unsolved murder. It is not only grief. It is ambiguity. The family knows someone took their loved one, but they do not know who. They do not know whether that person is watching them. They do not know whether the person will ever be caught. They do not know whether justice is possible. Every anniversary can reopen those questions. Every unanswered phone call can become a reminder. Every old photograph can become a confrontation with the past. When the killer is finally identified, one part of that uncertainty disappears. Diane's family finally had a name. And that name led to accountability. The case also became a reminder that victims should not disappear simply because an investigation becomes old. A cold case is still a murder. The passage of time does not lower the value of the victim's life. And physical evidence can sometimes preserve a connection that human memory cannot. Diane's fingerprint evidence had effectively become a message from 1969 to investigators in 2003. It said, in the simplest possible terms, someone was here. Decades later, technology helped answer who. That is what makes the evidence so powerful. Not because it tells the entire story by itself, but because it provides a starting point. A starting point strong enough to reopen a forgotten case. A starting point strong enough to identify a suspect. A starting point strong enough to produce a confession. A starting point strong enough to bring a decades-old murder into court. The case therefore became more than an individual homicide. It became an example of how criminal investigations can evolve. The original investigators did what they could with the tools they had. Later investigators did what they could with newer tools. Neither investigation existed separately. The second depended on the first. The modern breakthrough was built on evidence collected decades earlier. That is the hidden continuity of forensic work. Investigators may never meet the people whose work they inherit, but their decisions can determine whether a future detective has anything left to examine. In Diane's case, someone preserve the fingerprint. That decision mattered 34 years later. The case had survived because the evidence had survived. And the evidence survived because someone had recognized its importance when it was collected. Eventually, the courtroom brought the story to its legal conclusion. James Ray Davis was sentenced to life in prison. The murder of Diane Maxwell Jackson was solved. But the passage of time remained impossible to ignore. 34 years. That number represents more than a period on a calendar. It represents an entire generation. It represents a daughter growing up without her mother. It represents investigators aging and retiring. It represents a city transforming around an old crime. It represents decades during which the person responsible remained outside prison. And yet, after all of that, the evidence remained. The fingerprint remained. The case remained. And when investigators finally looked again, the past gave them the answer they had been waiting for. Diane Maxwell Jackson was no longer an unsolved name in an old homicide file. Her killer had been identified. Her killer had confessed. Her killer had been sentenced. But the most haunting part of the story was not the courtroom. It was the evidence that had existed long before the courtroom. A tiny pattern of ridges. A silent record. A mark left by a hand. For 34 years it said nothing. Then forensic technology gave it a voice. And that voice led investigators to James Ray Davis. The case was solved because someone, decades earlier, had preserved what seemed like a small piece of information. A fingerprint. Sometimes, that is all justice needs. Not a miracle. Not a confession waiting in a hidden room. Just one piece of evidence that refuses to disappear. The fingerprint had done what no witness had been able to do. It had survived 34 years. It had survived changing technology, changing investigators, changing streets, changing lives. And eventually, it had given detectives the name they needed. James Ray Davis. But identifying the man connected to the evidence was only one part of the story. The deeper question was what happened after the breakthrough. How does a murder investigation move from a forgotten fingerprint to a confession? How does a case born in 1969 suddenly become active again in 2003? The answer begins with persistence. Cold case detectives are often working against a powerful psychological force. The belief that if a case has remained unsolved for decades, it may be impossible to solve. That assumption can become dangerous. Because evidence does not always become useless with age. Sometimes, the opposite happens. Technology catches up with the evidence. A fingerprint that once produced nothing can eventually produce a name. A DNA sample that once could not be analyzed can later become identifiable. A photograph once too damaged to interpret can be enhanced. A database once too small to be useful can grow into something enormous. The evidence does not necessarily change. The tools do. Diane's murder demonstrated that principle with extraordinary clarity. In 1969, investigators had the fingerprint. In 2003, investigators had the technology. Between those 2 points were 34 years of silence. The silence was broken when the fingerprint was matched to James Ray Davis. That match changed the status of the case. For decades, Davis had been only one person among millions. After the match, he became the central figure in an old murder investigation. Investigators could finally begin asking questions that had been impossible to ask before. Where was Davis in 1969? What did he know about Diane? Why was his fingerprint associated with her vehicle? And what had happened during the encounter that ended Diane's life? The investigation now had direction. But the passage of time created a difficult obstacle. Davis was not being investigated for something that had happened yesterday. He was being questioned about an event more than 3 decades old. Memory can be complicated. People forget dates. They forget conversations. They forget locations. Sometimes they remember details incorrectly. Sometimes they remember exactly what happened. And sometimes, when confronted with evidence, they reveal something they have kept hidden for years. That final possibility became critical. Davis confessed. The confession transformed the investigation. The fingerprint had established a connection. The confession provided the human explanation. For investigators, the two pieces of information reinforced one another. The cold case now had a forensic lead and an admission from the suspect. The decades of uncertainty began to collapse. But behind the legal process was a much more personal reality. Diane's daughter had grown up without her mother. That fact had not changed in 34 years. The world around her changed. She changed. The murder remained. A person can learn to live with grief. But living with grief is not the same as receiving answers. An unsolved homicide creates a strange form of suspended time. The victim's life has ended. The family's life continues. The investigation appears to stop. But emotionally, the case remains unfinished. Every anniversary carries the same question. Every photograph carries the same absence. Every memory has an empty space where the victim should have been. Then the case is solved. The family is told that the suspect has been identified. Suddenly, the unfinished story has an ending. Not a happy ending. Not a restorative ending. But an ending. For Diane's family, the identity of her killer finally became known. The legal system could finally impose a sentence. James Ray Davis received life in prison. The result represented accountability for a murder that had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades. Yet even then, the case carried another lesson. The identity of a killer is not the same thing as the recovery of a victim's life. Diane remained 25 forever. That is the cruel mathematics of homicide. The victim's age stops. Everyone else continues. A child becomes an adult. A parent becomes a grandparent. A city becomes a different city. Technology changes, but the victim remains fixed at the moment of death. Diane's case therefore existed in 2 different timelines. The first was her life, 25 years. The second was the investigation, 34 years. Those timelines finally intersected in 2003. That was when the past became evidence again. The fingerprint was no longer just an artifact from an old crime scene. It became an investigative tool. The database search became a bridge. The suspect identification became a lead. The interrogation became a confrontation. The confession became a resolution. And the sentence became accountability. This chain is important because it shows that solving a cold case is rarely one dramatic event. It is a sequence. Evidence. Identification. Investigation. Questioning. Confession. Prosecution. Each step depends on the previous one. Break the chain anywhere, and the case may remain unsolved. The fingerprint was the first critical link. But the investigators still had to follow it. That required work. It required reviewing the original case. It required understanding the old evidence. It required connecting a modern identity to a decades-old crime. And it required asking questions that might have no easy answers. That is the nature of cold case work. There is no guarantee. A detective can reopen a case and find nothing. A database can return no match. A witness can refuse to talk. Evidence can be too degraded. A suspect can be dead. A case can remain unsolved forever. Diane's case was different because the evidence survived long enough to meet the right technology. That is what makes the story remarkable. The breakthrough was not created from nothing. It had been waiting. The original investigators had preserved the fingerprint. The later investigators had the ability to search it. 2 generations of detectives were connected by one piece of evidence. That continuity is often invisible. When a cold case is finally solved, people see the headline. Cold case solved. Suspect arrested. 34 years later. But behind the headline is a long chain of work. Someone collected the evidence. Someone documented it. Someone stored it. Someone preserved the records. Someone reopened the file. Someone searched the fingerprint. Someone recognized the match. Someone questioned the suspect. Someone built the case. The headline compresses all of that into a few words. Diane's story deserved more than a headline. She was not simply the victim in a cold case. She was a daughter, a mother, a young woman with a job and a future. Her life existed before the murder. That life matters because understanding the victim is part of understanding the crime. The investigation began with the fact of her death. But the deeper story was the destruction of an ordinary life. Diane's profession is especially striking. She worked as a telephone operator. Her work revolved around human connection. She helped people communicate. She connected calls. She was part of a system designed to make distance disappear. Yet after her death, distance became one of the defining features of the case. 34 years separated the murder from the identification of the killer. 34 years separated Diane's final days from the moment investigators could finally name the person responsible. The telephone connected voices instantly. The investigation took decades to connect Diane to her killer. That contrast makes the story feel almost symbolic. The technology that connected people so quickly in Diane's working life could not prevent her murder. And the forensic technology that eventually solved the murder did not exist when she died. The world changed twice around the same case. First, communications technology transformed daily life. Then forensic technology transformed the investigation. Diane's story crossed both eras. The fingerprint remained the constant. It was the physical thread running through all of them. For years, investigators had only an unidentified print. Then the print became an identity. Then the identity became a suspect. Then the suspect became a confessor. Then the confession became a conviction and a life sentence. That progression demonstrates why evidence preservation is so important. The person who collected the fingerprint in 1969 could never have known how valuable it would become decades later. They could not have predicted computerized fingerprint databases. They could not have predicted the exact technology that would eventually identify Davis. They simply preserved the evidence. That was enough. The rest belonged to the future. And the future eventually arrived. When Davis was identified, the investigation no longer had to search an invisible universe of possibilities. It had a target. The detectives could finally focus their questions. They could finally confront a person with the evidence. And the confrontation produced the answer Diane's family had been waiting for. Davis admitted responsibility. After 34 years, the unknown killer was no longer unknown. The legal system could act. He received a life sentence. The case was closed. But the emotional story was not. Because for Diane's daughter, solving the murder did not mean that her mother came back. It meant that the person who had taken her mother was finally known. That distinction is heartbreaking. Justice can punish. It cannot restore. A sentence can mark accountability. It cannot create another childhood. It cannot recreate a conversation between mother and daughter. It cannot give Diane another birthday. It cannot return the years that disappeared between 1969 and 2003. But it can prevent the crime from remaining unanswered forever. And sometimes, that is the most that the justice system can offer. A name. A confession. A sentence. A record that says the murder was not forgotten. Diane's story, therefore, became a warning against assuming that time automatically protects a killer. 34 years had passed. But the evidence had remained. The fingerprint did not forget. The case file did not forget. And eventually, investigators did not forget either. The case came back. The technology worked. The suspect was identified. The confession followed, and the long silence ended. Yet one question still hangs over every cold case solved after decades. How many others are still waiting? How many fingerprints remain unidentified? How many pieces of evidence sit inside old evidence rooms? How many families are still waiting for a phone call telling them that their loved one's case has finally moved? There's no simple answer. But Diane's case provides one reason not to give up. Because the evidence may already exist. The answer may already be there. It may be hidden inside something so small that nobody can see its future value. A fingerprint, a trace, a fragment, a record, waiting for the technology of another generation to reveal what it has been saying all along. Diane's fingerprint waited 34 years. Then it spoke. And when it did, it led investigators to James Ray Davis. The case had finally found its ending. But the story of justice did not erase the beginning. It began with a young mother in Houston. A life interrupted. A family left behind. And a question that remained unanswered for more than 3 decades. Until the evidence finally remembered what everyone else had been forced to forget. For 34 years, Diane Maxwell Jackson existed in the space between memory and evidence. Her family remembered her. The city had moved on. The police department had accumulated thousands of other investigations. Technology had transformed the way evidence was collected and analyzed. But inside the old case file, Diane remained exactly where she had been left in 1969. 25 years old. A mother. A Southwestern Bell telephone operator. A woman whose life had ended violently and whose killer had disappeared into the years. Then the fingerprint changed the equation. James Ray Davis was no longer an unknown figure. He was a name connected to physical evidence. And once investigators had that name, they could begin asking questions that had been impossible to answer for most of Diane's daughter's life. What had Davis been doing around Diane's vehicle? Why had he been there? What was the nature of the encounter? And what did he know about the murder? These were not questions that could be solved by technology alone. Computers could search fingerprints. They could identify a person. But they could not explain motive. They could not describe emotion. They could not reconstruct the human decisions that had turned an ordinary December day into a homicide. For that, investigators needed the suspect himself. And that meant confrontation. A cold case interview is different from an ordinary interrogation. The investigator carries decades of history into the room. The suspect may know exactly why the detectives are there. He may remember the crime. He may have spent years convincing himself that the past was buried. He may have believed the evidence was gone. He may have believed the investigators were gone. He may have believed that time itself had become a shield. Then the door opens, and the past walks in. By 2003, Davis was confronted with evidence from a crime that had occurred 34 years earlier. The fingerprint was no longer an anonymous mark. It had been identified. The case had been reopened, and investigators wanted answers. At that moment, the entire architecture of the old investigation changed. For decades, the police had been asking, who? Now they could ask Davis directly. What happened to Diane? The answer eventually came from the man himself. Davis confessed to killing her. The confession was the moment when the forensic trail became a human story. A fingerprint had established the connection. The confession provided the acknowledgement. Together, they transformed the case. But there was something else happening beneath the surface. A confession after 3 decades does not simply close a file. It forces everyone connected to the case to confront the passage of time. Imagine the difference between the Houston of 1969 and the Houston of 2003. In 1969, the city was entering a new era of growth and transformation. The technology of daily life was radically different. Telephones were physical objects connected to fixed lines. News traveled through newspapers. television, and radio. Police records were overwhelmingly paper-based. Fingerprint searches depended heavily on systems that were nowhere near the scale of modern databases. By 2003, investigators were working in an increasingly digital world. Computers had become central to police work. Forensic databases had expanded. The ability to compare evidence had improved. The same fingerprint that had remained unidentified in one generation could become decisive in another. That is the strange power of time in a cold case. Time can destroy evidence, but time can also create opportunity. Technology advances. Databases expand. Old cases become newly searchable. And suddenly, something that seemed useless becomes valuable. Diane's case was one of those cases. The evidence had survived long enough. The technology had advanced far enough. And investigators were willing to look again. The breakthrough, therefore, depended on more than one person. It depended on the investigators who collected and preserved the fingerprint in 1969. It depended on the later investigators who reopened the case. It depended on the technology capable of searching the print. And it depended on the evidence being preserved for 34 years. Remove any one of those elements, and the story could have ended differently. The fingerprint might have been lost. The file might have remained inactive. The case might never have been revisited. Davis might never have been identified. But that did not happen. The evidence remained. And eventually, the system caught up with it. The confession gave the investigators what the fingerprint alone could never provide. It supplied a direct admission of responsibility. That mattered enormously. Because investigators were no longer trying to persuade the public that an old fingerprint might mean something. They were dealing with a suspect who had acknowledged killing Diane. The mystery had become a case, and the case had become a prosecution. For Diane's family, this was the moment when a 34-year-old question finally had an answer. But there was another emotion that often accompanies the solving of a cold case. Anger. Not only anger at the killer, anger at time. 34 years had passed. Why did it take so long? Why could the answer not have been found earlier? Why did Diane's daughter have to grow up without her mother? Why did the family have to live through birthdays, holidays, and milestones without knowing who was responsible? These questions are difficult because they do not have simple answers. Investigators in 1969 were working with the tools available to them. The technology of 2003 was different. The case was not necessarily ignored. It was unresolved. That distinction is important. A cold case does not always mean police stopped caring. Sometimes it means the available evidence could not produce a suspect. Sometimes the evidence exists, but the technology cannot yet use it. Sometimes investigators have a strong theory but cannot prove it. Sometimes the person responsible remains outside the system. And sometimes, years later, something changes. Diane's case changed because the fingerprint became searchable in a new way. That single development reopened possibilities that had been closed for decades. Suddenly, the case was not an old murder. It was an active investigation again. That transformation can be almost surreal for detectives. A case file that has sat untouched for years can suddenly become urgent. Names are pulled. Records are examined. Old photographs are reviewed. Evidence is tested. Investigators begin reconstructing the victim's final days. The past becomes present, and every detail begins to matter again. Diane's vehicle became especially important because it contained the physical trace that ultimately identified Davis. A vehicle can tell investigators a great deal. Who touched it? Where someone may have been. What objects may have been left behind. How a victim moved. What sequence of events might have occurred. But a vehicle is also just an object. It cannot speak. It cannot explain intention. The investigator has to build meaning around it. That is what happened with Diane's case. The fingerprint was a fact. The match was a fact. The confession was a fact. The investigators had to connect those facts into a coherent explanation of the murder. And eventually, the legal system accepted that explanation. Davis received a life sentence. The sentence marked the end of the prosecution. But the case remained a remarkable example of how physical evidence can outlive the people connected to it. Think about the fingerprint itself. A human hand touched the vehicle. The ridges made contact with the surface. The person moved away. The moment ended. But the print remained. Then the investigation ended. The print remained. The detectives changed. The print remained. The city changed. The print remained. The technology changed. The print remained. And finally, the print became identifiable. That is almost the entire story of forensic evidence in one image. A moment that lasts less than a second can become important decades later. The person who leaves the evidence may never imagine that it will matter. The investigator who collects it may never live to see it solved. But the evidence can continue through generations. This is why the preservation of physical evidence is so important in homicide investigations. A detective cannot always know which clue will become decisive. A seemingly minor trace may become the most important object in the case. Diane's fingerprint is a perfect example. It did not solve the murder in 1969. It did not identify Davis immediately. It did not produce an arrest. Instead, it waited. For decades. Then modern technology turned the unidentified print into a name. That name led to an investigation. The investigation led to a confession. The confession led to prosecution. And prosecution led to a life sentence. The chain was complete. But even when a chain is complete, there is always a human cost beneath it. Diane's daughter had lost her mother. Nothing in the chain could change that. The justice system could establish who was responsible. It could impose punishment. It could place the killer behind bars. But it could not recreate the life that had been taken. That is the boundary of justice. It can answer. It can punish. It can document. But it cannot reverse time. And perhaps that is why the conclusion of a cold case can feel strangely incomplete. The headline says the case is solved. The suspect is convicted. The investigation is closed. But the victim is still gone. The family still carries the loss. The years still happened. 34 years cannot be returned. They can only be acknowledged. For Diane, the acknowledgement came through the evidence. Her case was not forgotten. The fingerprint remained. The investigation eventually returned. The suspect was identified. And the man responsible was held accountable. That matters because every unsolved homicide carries the possibility that the victim's story will eventually disappear beneath newer tragedies. Crime never stops. New cases arrive. New victims need investigators. New evidence demands attention. Old files can be pushed further down the shelves. But Diane's case survived. It survived because someone preserved the evidence. It survived because investigators eventually looked again. And it survived because technology made the old fingerprint useful. The case therefore became a quiet argument against the idea that a murder automatically becomes unsolvable simply because decades have passed. Time is powerful, but it is not absolute. A killer can grow older. A city can change. A witness can forget. But evidence can wait. And sometimes, waiting is enough. In Diane's case, 34 years of waiting ended with a name. James Ray Davis, the man whose fingerprint had been recovered from Diane's vehicle. The man who eventually confessed. The man who received a life sentence. The mystery had finally been answered. Yet the most chilling part remained the same. Diane had never been able to tell investigators what happened. She could not identify her killer. She could not explain the final moments of her life. She could not testify. She could not point toward the evidence. She could only leave behind the physical traces of her existence. And one of those traces became the voice of the dead, a fingerprint. Silent for 34 years. Then, suddenly powerful enough to reopen an entire murder investigation. The evidence had remembered what the city had nearly forgotten. And once the fingerprint spoke, the case could never be the same again.